afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Spacepower Forum today. We're really pleased to host Lieutenant General Saltzman, Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Operations, Cyber, and Nuclear for United States Space Force. As a Chief Operations Officer, General Saltzman has overall responsibility for intelligence, operations, sustainment, cyber and nuclear ops of the United States Space Force. Prior to his current position, he was the Deputy Commander, Combined Force Air Component Command for U.S. Central Command. He also previously served as the head of the MDC-2 Enterprise Capability Collaboration Team. So welcome, Salty, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. And congratulations again on your recent promotion. It's certainly well-deserved. What I'd like to do to kick things off this afternoon is give you the opportunity to make a few opening remarks, and then we'll shift over to questions and answers to get your insights. So with that, over to you.
Great. Thanks, General Deptula. It's a real privilege to be here. You know, I'm a big fan of the Mitchell Institute and greatly appreciate all the work you've done for the Air Force over the years, but now the Space Force as well. So really appreciate the opportunity. What I thought I'd do to kick things off is I know that many that are joining us today aren't eyeball deep in establishing the Space Force the way I am. So I thought I'd just give a quick outline of kind of where we are on the organizational stand-up, the priorities we're pursuing, and then I'll dive into my role a little bit as the Chief Operations Officer. So at the headquarters, let me start there. Here in the Pentagon, the Space Force headquarters, we just recently are very proud that we got confirmation of General D.T. Thompson as the Vice Chief of Space Operations. And from a headquarters perspective, that now kind of completes the senior leadership team, if you will. We have 2 4-stars. General Raymond as the Chief of Space Operations, and now General Thompson as his Vice Chief. There are 3 3-stars. Nina Armagno, Lieutenant General Armagno, is the Director of Staff. Lieutenant General Bill LaCourie is the Chief of Strategy and Resources. That's the S5-8, if you will, in that nomenclature. And I'm the Chief Operations Officer, which actually includes the functions of the 2, the 3, the 4, the 6, and the 10. So I'm not trying to brag. I got a lot of letters and numbers associated with my title. But to avoid that, I just kind of talk about myself as the Chief Operations Officer. And so we'll go into that in a little more detail. Additionally, a little bit innovative, but we have Major General Kim Kreider is our Chief of Technology and Innovation. And then Miss Pat Mulcahy is our Chief of Human Capital. And so the kind of S1, if you will. Out in the field, we're organized around 3 field commands. So we have Space Operations Command, which officially doesn't stand up until next week, the 21st of October, where it will be commanded by now Major General, soon to be Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting. And that command will be the force provider to all the combatant commands for Space Force capabilities. It also will serve as the service component to U.S. Space Command. And so that's that primary warfighting force provider function out in the field. Additionally, we'll have Space Systems Command, which will stand up next year. It's not just renaming Space and Missile Center. It's not the SMC that's out in LA now. It's going to have broader, more expansive responsibilities for science and technology, research and development, the lab efforts, and it will also include the launch enterprise. So our launch deltas that will be responsible for launching and spacelift at Vandenberg and Patrick will fall under the Space Systems Command. And then the 3rd field command is to be stood up next year as well, and that's Space Training and Readiness Command, which nicely kind of condenses down into STAR Command. So STAR Command will be our training and education of the force. It'll do operational tests. It'll do advanced training, readiness exercises. Our doctrine development will be done there. So that'll be a really important effort as we develop our warfighting culture, if you will, in the service. Each of these field commands will be organized to support subordinate deltas. And so that's a new organizational structure that we're carving out of the Space Force. So you won't hear us talk about wings in the Space Force. It'll be deltas. And so they're very mission focused, commanded by colonels. And right now we have 9 of these mission deltas that are centered around our traditional mission areas like space domain awareness and ISR and cyber, but we'll also have a new one. Orbital warfare is one of the mission deltas that we'll have out there. And so, you know, I think the last thing I'll say on the organization of the Space Force is that, you know, it's going to be a little bit limited in terms of the kinds of traditional AFSCs that you might see from an Air Force standpoint. It's limited right now to space operations, intelligence, cyber engineering, and the program managers necessary for that direct space operations look. So we'll still be leaning very heavily on the Air Force for many of our common functions and base support. We'll still use the Air Force Personnel Center, the Air Force Recruiting Service. We're going to rely on the Air Force for our accessions, the Academy, OTS, BMT, et cetera. We'll rely on the public affairs and civil engineers and security forces and all of those traditional base ops support or common areas that we'll share. We're going to rely heavily on the Air Force for that for some time. Let me shift real quick and I'll run through kind of General Raymond's top priorities. You know, in no particular order the way I'm presenting them, but because they're all important. We're really focused on empowering a lean and agile service. And you know, that's kind of sounds like a bumper sticker, but when you're going to be as small as we are, we can't let lean equal under-resourced. And so this really means not just not very many people. It means how do we change our processes? How do we change the way we're doing business so that their processes and our procedures are lean and agile, so that the small number of people that we have becomes an advantage to us in terms of decision speed, flattening bureaucracy, et cetera. And so we're trying to focus on being lean and agile and not pay too much of a penalty for being a small service. The second priority is developing joint warfighters in world-class teams. And you know, this audience, I'm sure, is uniquely aware that, you know, it's all about the people. And if you get the right people, you give them the right training, the right education, the right experiences, there's almost nothing they can't do. And so we're really focused on making sure that our members of the Space Force are joint-minded. They are teammates from the beginning. We're going to reach out across industry. We're going to reach out to our joint brothers and sisters. We're going to reach out especially to the Air Force and have a tight partnership, OSD, and we're going to make sure that we focus on the right things and that our people are trained and educated to do the work that they need to do. The third one is delivering capabilities at operationally relevant speeds. And I know this is near and dear to your heart, sir. You know, it's not enough just to develop exquisite capabilities. If you don't get them in the hands of the operators, at a speed that still allows them to take advantage of the situation, you know, the perfect design 2 years too late is not the perfect design anymore. And so we are really focused on faster acquisition, innovating quickly, and getting joint warfighting capabilities in the hands of our warfighters and those effects out to the field as rapidly as possible moving forward. The fourth one is expanding cooperation to enhance prosperity and security, and that's a big one. That's a lot of different partnerships there. But that's the idea. Is again, because we're small, we are going to lean heavily on partnerships, whether it's the civil, commercial interests, whether it's other governments in terms of allies and partners, and again, our sister services. We are going to rely and reach out and integrate tightly across all those communities to get the most out of our capabilities and the most out of what we can deliver back to the nation. And then lastly, you'll hear General Raymond talk about this all the time, and I don't want to underestimate it as the last one, but creating a digital service to accelerate innovation. We really want to be from the outset tech savvy, using the available technologies to make the most out of our resources. Like I said, we have a small number of people. We want them to be very productive. We think there's technology that can support that. We want digital literacy to be a second language of all of our personnel in the Space Force, and so we're committed to, from the beginning, thinking ourselves as a digital service for the purpose of accelerating and optimizing our limited resources. So with that as backdrop, let me just real quick, sir, outline kind of what the Chief Operations Officer does, because that, that's a term that I think those in corporate America might understand more so than the military. And we did that deliberately. We are using the nomenclature of the C-suites, if you will, as the COO for a couple of purposes. One is I want to make sure people don't think of me as just the 2, 3, 4, 6, 10. That would be a disservice to what we're capable of doing, because we're going to have to do things differently, and there's a lot of power in a name. And so I want them not to see me as a intel officer or an operator or a sustainer. I want them to see me as an integrated chief of all operations. And so by naming it that way and calling it out that way, it prevents us from building those functional stovepipes that sometimes hinders information crossflow. And so we're really mindful of that in that name. And then the second thing that we're trying to leverage is the idea from corporate America again, where one of the COO's primary responsibilities is to assess organizational performance. Are we meeting our organizational goals? Where are we falling short? Where are there opportunities to get better? And so that's going to be at the top of my list, is to be that primary assessor for how is the Space Force doing with regards to the things it's trying to accomplish. And my organizing question is, simply put, is the Space Force organized, trained, and equipped to effectively meet its cornerstone responsibilities? And we've outlined those responsibilities in our most recent capstone Doctrine document as preserving freedom of action in space, enabling joint lethality and effectiveness, and providing independent options to achieve strategic effects. And so as a service and as the Chief Operations Officer, I want to know how well we're doing those things that we're trying to accomplish. And the team here is kind of tired of me hearing about it, so I'll take this opportunity to hit a new audience. I attack those responsibilities by asking 3 questions over and over and over again. What's going on? So what? And what's next? And so I have a team divided, and it's a cross-functional team whose job is to go out and collect all the data, collect all the reports, to make sure that we comprehensively understand all of the missions, operations, systems, activities, threats, conditions that are out there that affect our operations. That's the what. The so what is the context. I have a team devoted to figuring out what do those things that we're observing, what do they mean to us? What are the impacts? What are the root causes for the problems that we're seeing or the shortfalls we're having? What are our vulnerabilities as we try to accomplish some of these missions? And so I have a team focused on just assessing the so what of those operations. And then finally is what's next? What are we going to do about it? What are our mitigation strategies? What can I do with the force I have? How can I do it better? Whether it's policy, guidance, new procedures, new tactics, new capabilities in some instances, we're going to have a team focused on that. So what, and what's next? And so that's just a quick overview of kind of the Chief Operations Officer and how I fit into this. And hopefully that gives you a little background on the Space Force. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for that insight, Salty. And before we jump into more detail, my compliments to General Raymond and you and those who put together an organizational structure that breaks out of the mold that, at least the organizational mold that the military has been in for way too long. This, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus structure is a pre-industrial age Napoleonic construct that simply creates stovepipes. So it's great to hear that General Raymond and his senior leadership, to include you, have come up with a modern way that is a lot more common sense and that fits more into the realities about that will allow you to get to the core and key issues in a much less stovepipe fashion. So let's jump in and dig a little deeper into some of the other topics that you covered. I appreciated your comment during AFA's recent virtual airspace and cyber conference that Space Comms Commander General Dickinson should argue for a budget based on the size of his area of responsibility. That'd be a heck of a budget. But given that SpaceCom has to fight and defend the space capabilities that serve as enablers to every other combatant command, Could you speak a bit to the Space Force's budget allocation? For example, do you think the service's FY21 budget, which accounted for just over 2% of the total DoD budget, is sufficient?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important question, sir. I won't pretend that I was in all of the right meetings to fully articulate the concerns and the trade-offs that had to be made. I'll say from my vantage point, and you know this as being an operator yourself, there's never enough. There's never enough. There's always more capability we can pursue. There's always more integration. There's always more people. I've never once gotten an extra member of the team and had to sit them over in the corner because I wasn't sure what to tell them to do. And so, the problem is we have an insatiable appetite because they expect so much of us. They in the grand sense of, the nation and our partners and our allies, there's a lot of expected of us. And so, I think the short answer, just to be honest with you, is of course not. It's never enough. But that's because so much is expected of us. Now, I will say we're getting the most for the dollars that we've been given. And part of that is because now as a service, we are focused. We are focused on what is it that we need. We are assessing where our gaps and our shortfalls are. And we're able to articulate at a service level exactly where we think resources need to be spent. Having that elevated to the service level, I think allowed us to provide better articulation and better advocacy for where our shortfalls were and how we should spend our resources. The higher question about is it enough, this is about trade-offs across the services, and you've been in these budget battles before. It's a zero-sum game to some degree. But I will say, as a new service, I was really pleased with the way we articulated what our requirements are. And if we didn't get everything we wanted, at least we've set the foundation to build onto it with subsequent budgets, because our story now is being told with a laser focus on that contested space domain. And I'm looking forward to the next set of opportunities to get more resources.
Yeah, that's great to hear. A bit of a follow-on. What, if anything, is being done so that the other services, besides the Air Force, as well as the intelligence community, are contributing resources that align with their space mission requirements?
Yeah, well, it starts with just a survey of what the other services are doing currently and whether or not it's appropriate for them to keep them or to transfer them over to the Space Force. That's an ongoing discussion. As a member of the Ops Dep, we have those discussions routinely, and we're going to have a focus session in the Ops Dep coming up next week on just that topic. So that's one aspect of it. But I'll tell you, I can see power on both sides of this, quite frankly. Bolstering the Space Force with capacity and units and capability clearly would give us more resources, more enterprise look at how we're doing our mission set. But at the same time, because space is so critical, not unlike air, sir, I think you would agree, every service has an Air Force because of how critical fighting and contesting in the air domain is, or how much power you get out of leveraging the air domain. Space is no different. And so as a joint team, it doesn't surprise me that the other services also want space capability. The question will just be, what's the most efficient and effective way to field that enterprise approach? How do you leverage the fact that you now have a Space Force that can focus on certain aspects of it while leveraging that interest across the broader domain in the joint fight? It's a very nuanced discussion, and it's happening at the highest levels.
No, thanks for that. And let me offer just a bit of a recommendation for you in describing what you just said. Each of the services do not have an Air Force. There are 3 of the services that have air arms, and those air arms are there to enhance and support the core functions of their respective services. The nation only has one Air Force that is solely designed to provide options to achieve directly our nation's security objectives. So just a bit of a nuance there.
Hey, sir, I joined the Space Force and I forgot all my Air Force terminology. You're exactly
that's all right. Your points are spot on. And I would also add, you got to include the Air Force in there. So that's a whole nother discussion subject, is where is the Air Force's space component? I'm going to discuss that with the chief next week. But
So just to finish that thought, though, sir, you bring up a critical point, and I'll add the nuance that when the department is considering how best to contest the air, it only goes to one service. And likewise, when they ask the questions about how do we best contest and compete in the space domain, they're only going to come to one service. And so I think that makes that point.
that's very good. Outstanding. Well, now, you mentioned in your opening remarks the Spacepower Doctrine, and it notes the need to independently achieve strategic effects, which I would suggest requires the ability to project power in, from, and to space. So what does this mean in terms of the Space Force's approach to investments in counter space capabilities?
I think it's critical. We just said the nation, the Department certainly of Defense, is going to turn to the Space Force and say, how are we going to contest and compete in the space domain to ensure that we maintain the strategic advantage that we've enjoyed for years, and that is squarely on our shoulders. And so again, now you have service level discussions saying, how do we protect and defend what we already have? And sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And so we are exploring all those opportunities. And right now it's mostly science and technology and R&D, because again, we don't want to throw good money after bad. But those discussions are ongoing because we think it's our responsibility to take it on.
Very good. Now, you've noted in the past that space is inherently a multi-domain operation. So unsurprisingly, space is featured predominantly in the early ABMS on-ramp demonstrations in support of the JADC2 concept. This is something that you're intimately familiar with your previous work. What are some of your takeaways from the early ABMS demonstrations, both in terms of what's worked well so far and where the Space Force could add capability?
Well, first, I'm a proud father of multi-domain C2, and watched it grow up into joint all-domain command and control. And I really believe that some of those foundational principles that we discovered, a couple years ago, I still see that thread pulled through. And so I know we're on the right track. Things like accessibility of data, things like resilient self-healing networks. These are foundational principles, foundational capabilities. And I see those in the ABMS on-ramps. I see the emphasis being placed on those in future iterations for how ABMS and other JADC2 work is done. Project Convergence, done by the Army. We see the exact same kinds of principles being pulled through. And so that's what makes me happy, is that I really do feel like that MDC2 team set a foundation of principles that are now being applied tangibly as we start to develop the systems and bring it to life, if you will. So what doesn't make me as happy is how long it takes. This is just the nature, sometimes I think, of a large organization trying to synchronize across multiple fronts, multiple services, multiple budget drills, multiple acquisition projects. And so there has to be a level of patience. But what I don't see is any abandonment of those principles. I don't see 2 steps back, 1 step forward. I think it's more like just 2 steps forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps forward. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We're focused on the right kinds of things. And I do believe it builds momentum as we start talking about common data standards, common internet protocols, easier integration, lowering thresholds so that smaller companies can engage the department and offer their ideas and make it easier for them to integrate into our capabilities. Those things are hard at first, but as you start to lock those into place, you start to build momentum and can go faster. So that's what I see in terms of big trending, and now we just got to keep the pressure on.
No, that's very good. I'd also make the observation that ultimately what the JADC2 ABMS is all about is ubiquitous and seamless sharing of information. And like you said, that's not going to happen overnight, because the issues deal with all the services as well. Recently, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Army signed a a memorandum of understanding agreement between the two, but the Navy's kind of out there on their own. So until we have a Secretary of Defense that makes this a key issue and asks about it every weekly staff meeting, it's going to be a challenge. But even with that kind of support, like you say, it's going to take a while to get secure, robust, and reliable connectivity. Let's switch gears for a second. You mentioned readiness in your opening remarks. Could you expand a bit on what constitutes readiness for the Space Force, how it's accomplished, what units of measure are used, and so on? This is something that I discussed with General Bunch when he was here in terms of assessing aircraft readiness based on their mission capable rates. Now that unit of measure certainly doesn't apply for typical Space Force capabilities. So how are you looking at assessing, describing, and reporting on Space Force readiness?
I'm really glad you asked that, because it's at the top of my list. When in terms of assessing how well are we doing what we're trying to do, in my job as COO, readiness is that term of art that we use to kind of express, can you do your mission or not? And so literally, when I conclude here, I'm going to walk next door and take a readiness brief from the field. And I'll tell you, I've got a lot of experience here. I'm going to be underwhelmed. And the reason I'm going to be underwhelmed is because, quite frankly, we took a system that was primarily designed to show how Air Force expeditionary units made themselves ready for deployment or for a high-end fight. And we've tried to make that system work for space operations that largely operates from garrison and is doing its day-to-day mission every day. It's combatant command mission every day. And so readiness, it just never had the same kind of flavor because we didn't have to pick up and go somewhere and join into a fight. Now, that's not true across the board, and I don't mean to paint that with too broad of a brush, but those that understand the space mission, I think, get the point, is that we have to describe our readiness differently. And right now, our readiness drill really comes down to, do you have enough people to man your consoles 24 hours a day? That is one small, important, but small piece of what readiness is. Now we're starting to have discussions about advanced training, the letter of X's, if you will. What is it that is required of a crew force to be ready for that high-end fight? And when are they ready? And what are the training opportunities they need? What are the exercises and experiences that they need in order to be ready for the fight that we may need them to have in on orbit against a near peer competitor? And so we're just going to reshuffle the deck a little bit and say, okay, no kidding. How do we assess that we are ready for that kind of a fight? We'll have the day-to-day requirements still with the U.S. Space Command and generating effects for the warfighters. We're not going to abandon that at all, but I want to make sure we're capturing the broader advanced training, operational tests, TTP development and enhancements, the WEPTAC model, all of those things that we've learned about what it takes to truly be ready for the high-end fight, and make sure that our forces are adopting those best practices. Over.
Very good. That's very insightful, and appreciate that. Now, another kind of different but very important subject area, the Air Force's recently released Arctic strategy notes that the challenges of operating in space are particularly acute for the Arctic. There have also been several capacity shortfalls in the Arctic region that the Space Force is working to address, such as hosting enhanced polar system recapitalization payloads on Norwegian satellites to improve comm capacity. Could you elaborate a little bit further on what else the Space Force is doing in this increasingly vital region?
Yeah, this is a tough one because we don't have a lot of experience, as a department operating up there, and so we're kind of learning as we go in some regards. Obviously, orbital mechanics that put satellites in position to be effective over the Eurasian landmass are quite different than orbital mechanics required to put satellites to operate over the Arctic, and so we just need to be, attuned to the fact that that's not where our coverage areas are optimized. We certainly have some sensors that are optimized there, but maybe not sufficient. when it comes to comm or when it comes to IR. Maybe we're more limited there than we need to be. And as competition starts to move into that new AOR in the north, we probably need to start to revisit exactly how our sensors are arrayed, how our operations are laid out to make sure that we're covering that area as well. There's electromagnetic obstacles up there that you don't contend with in other places. Our ground stations aren't optimized for line of sight to sensors in those areas. I mean, from a space standpoint, we just haven't been oriented to look from the north down. And so I think as we start to determine exactly what our shortfalls are and prioritize those shortfalls amongst all the other things, then we'll have to make the changes that put us in a better position.
Thanks for that. A couple of weeks ago when Chuck Beams was here, he discussed how wargaming exercises incorporating space systems repeatedly demonstrated that the greatest threat to orbiting satellites are cyber attacks. Could you speak a little bit on what the Space Force is doing to harden its assets from such attacks?
Yeah, a couple things. One is, like I mentioned with integrated operations under the COO, I have cyber experts integrated throughout my divisions. So I don't have a cyber division. I don't have a space superiority division. I have a current ops division that includes all of that. I have a mission assessment division that includes all of that. And I have a future ops division that includes all of that. I want that to be an integrated approach. I learned early on flying satellites that, satellites are terrific, but if you can't close the link between the antenna on the ground and the antenna on orbit, those satellites are useless. And then once that information comes back down to that antenna on the ground, you've got to move it around somewhere to some fusion center or to some user of that data. And that makes cyber absolutely, intrinsically and completely integrated into our capabilities. And that's why I've always said, you mentioned it earlier, this is inherently a multi-domain operation. The space domain is where some of our effects are received and generated, and then we have to bring it back to Earth to make it relevant, and we do that through cyber effects and through the networks and stuff. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're asking all those same questions you would ask about any mission set. Where are vulnerabilities? What can we do to mitigate those vulnerabilities? And what's the first best step to get after it? I will also tell you that we know that this is not about setting up a firewall that keeps everybody out. This is not a moat with a high wall. We have to recognize that there's going to be, because of such an open system, there's going to be bad actors infiltrating. And so I like to think of it more like an immune system in your body. Viruses in this COVID time, we're all keenly aware of how this works, but viruses are going to come in. It's about how fast your body can identify it and fight it off and get you back to normal. And so that's how I kind of think about the cyber environment. Things are going to come in because we have to stay connected, because we have to share information. There are going to be some vulnerabilities in there. We just have to recognize them immediately and then be able to sort it out and mitigate it rapidly.
Hey, that's a great analogy, Salty, if I could comment. And it's your answer is also a demonstration of the integrated approach that you're taking with your new COO hat, and it reflects how you describe your organization. So good on you. A bit of a follow-up, if we widen the aperture a bit, other countries are continuing to develop and test counter space capabilities, while the number of states out there that possess such capabilities continues to expand. So how's the Space Force thinking about mitigating the vulnerability of its current assets, as well as improving its ability to rapidly reconstitute capabilities that are attacked? You spoke a little bit to I think it answered the first portion of that question, but what about rapidly reconstituting capabilities that are attacked?
Yes, sir. I would say the one benefit we have as we build this new Space Force is that we are also building it at the exact same time that there is such a large investment in the corporate launch infrastructure. New space, or however you want to describe that, is going gangbusters. It's driving the cost and price points for launching per pound onto orbit down to much more reasonable values. So to some degree, operational launch has always been about how fast you can, stack a rocket, put something on top of it, integrate the system, and get it on orbit. But in reality, it was about how much are you willing to pay and how often in order to be operationally responsive. So as that cost and that price point comes down, we're going to see a lot more operationally responsive launch, quite frankly. The second thing is we're recognizing that these enormous satellites that do everything for everybody are probably not they're really also really good targets. And so that might not be the best approach from a redundancy, from a resiliency standpoint. So as we start to disaggregate those requirements and go to smaller satellites and distribute that architecture over far more systems, one, it creates a targeting problem for the adversary. And two, it's a lot cheaper to launch because you're not putting so much weight onto orbit. You can launch multiple satellites at a time for any launch, and we're going to take full advantage of that. And so there's a resiliency aspect just to disaggregating the requirements on orbit and start to think about smaller sats and more of them over a shorter period of life cycle. Over.
Great. Now, sort of related, keeping U.S. Force posture mobile and flexible is crucial to keeping one step ahead of adversary planning. And it's something we've seen other services exercise in various ways. How can the United States bring that operational unpredictability in space while at the same time ensuring safe space traffic awareness?
That's a great question. I mean, that's a balancing act to some degree. You want to be provocative, unpredictable, so that you can kind of keep your adversaries and competitors off balance. And at the same time, you want to demonstrate, norms of behavior that we would call safe, safe intercepts in the air world, and the laws of the sea that keep people safe navigating over the waters. Those are all important to us because in an ideal world, that's what we would want to pursue. So you'll hear from us talking about safe practices and norms of behavior in space, because once everybody agrees to it and once everybody generally starts to operate that way, then nefarious activities and intent can be more easily picked out of the noise. Right now, it's hard to tell whether something is provocative, whether it's an act of war, or whether it's just sloppy behavior, or whether it's maybe operator error. So as we get better at this across the entire world and all of the spacefaring nations and start to develop these norms of behavior, I think it'll have that effect of allowing us to be provocative when we want to, but to recognize intent from an adversary in more clear terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Well, listen, I've got one more for you before we open it up to our audience. It's a bit specific, but what are the most promising avenues for DoD to rapidly and affordably expand its MIL-SATCOM capacity, which I know is an issue?
Well, it's interesting the way you phrase the question is, how do we expand our MIL-SATCOM capabilities? And I might have to kind of question the premise if you don't mind, because what we really need is SATCOM capacity. And so whether or not the satellites are owned and operated by the military, or whether we are just a customer of satellite communications, I think there is so much that can be gained by taking advantage of what the commercial sector offers us in terms of satellite communications. And we could focus on how do we protect our data, how do we protect the RF link, and not worry about putting transponders on orbit, but worrying about how do we secure the data that's moving over those networks. And so I see this as a kind of a two-part shift. One is leverage more of the commercial sector in terms of the bandwidth, and then put our resources against the best way to protect it and move the data through that network that's provided by the commercial network. So it's MIL-SATCOM effects, but it's leveraging commercial SATCOM and then military grade security, if you will. Over.
Perfect. Sounds great. Well, we've come to the end of this segment of our discussion, Salty, and thanks again for all your insightful comments and sharing your perspectives on our new Space Force. Our next event next week on Wednesday, October 21st, I'll be hosting our new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Charles Q. Brown, and we hope to see you all there. And then one other point I wanted to make you and our audience aware of, the Mitchell Institute is planning to stand up a Space Force Center of Excellence. So if you have any good ideas for folks who would like to come and work for us in that regard, I'd love to hear them. Well, that's a great way to wrap up this Aerospace Nation event. And what I'd like to do is offer a big thanks to General Saltzman, to you, Salty, and our audience, from all of us here at the Mitchell Institute. Have a great aerospace power kind of day, and I wish you success on your next meeting on space readiness.